Trower. I'm the founder of Balance Integration, and I started the company. It's kind of a funny story. I started the company because I was working in corporate America, and I was working for Time Warner back when it merged with AOL, and they were going to take over the media world, and it was all very exciting and very frightening. And one thing I realized, because I had worked in a lot of Fortune 500s as well as startups, but one thing I realized was that there's a real gap between who we are as human beings and how we present ourselves in the collective, trying to get things done in organizations. And there was one moment that really drove home to me the idea that oftentimes the more successful we are, or we aspire to be, the more frightened we become. And this is a really small example, but I feel like it's probably pretty relatable. I realized every time I got on the elevator and a cleaning person would come on the elevator, they would smile and make eye contact and ask me about my day, my vacation, whatever. And when the C-suite would get on the elevator, this was before everyone had a phone all the time, they would stare at the wall. And it really struck me that something happens as we climb the ladder of success, or something happens to us as we set our sights on having that as being our outcome, that somehow we're leaving a large portion of who we are as a human being. It's almost like we're amputating pieces of ourselves, and we have fallen prey to this false conviction that that is somehow part and parcel of succeeding. That is somehow part and parcel of being a leader, which is actually, I think all of us on this call would probably agree, the opposite of what's actually the case. Have you guys had experiences like that, where you're more able to connect with someone who is still kind of seeing themselves in a purely human capacity, as opposed to being a quote unquote leader? Does that make sense? Yeah. So it bothered me, and it bothered me enough to quit my job and start a company, really feeling my way into this question: how do we be fully human at work? And whether we do that as an individual braving what might be seen as a legacy or more traditional culture, or whether we're stakeholders or culture keepers for the collective and kind of charged with having that be part of the operational norm of where we work. Show of hands, who here is in an HR capacity or somehow involved in being a culture keeper? I call you guys the fire keepers. I'm just curious. So Tom says vaguely. Okay. So this talk is really going to be focused on what's going on in corporate culture. It's also going to talk about what we've seen specifically, and then things that you guys can do to start to shift that conversation. We got 2 questions in advance of connecting. Someone asked for tips for employee engagement, and someone else asked for how do we convince management to take on culture more seriously. And so that's absolutely what we're going to talk about. Is there anything else on anyone's wish list that they're like, oh my God, I really hope we touch on? Okay. Let me know if something comes up. So I'm going to pop into sharing my screen, because I want to share a study that I've been working with a lot. Hang on, let me make that go away. And the reason I want to share this is I feel like it's a really powerful way for you to be able to make the case to your management. I'm a firm believer that part of what is undermining our ability to have a healthy culture, to have engagement, is not only trust, but it's actually authenticity at work, right? And the flip side of that is imposter syndrome, is a sense that we have to pretend to be something that we're not in order to survive the tribal culture that is a corporate culture. So this is just a free offer. If you guys want to spend time with me talking about what's going on in your culture, just reach out in the next couple of weeks, and it's on me. So this is the outcomes, literally the testimonials from a study that we did for one of our clients, right? And I just want you to look at the themes that come up, right? And the themes are really around people zinging one another, people setting themselves aside from the people that they are leading or managing, right? The ability to win, right? This kind of psychopathic competition within the organization, lack of teamwork, lack of cooperation. And this is a company, I'm not going to say the name, obviously, because this is hugely alarming, right? When you look at this. But this is a company that has spent the past 5 years really focused on improving their culture. They have a new CEO, right? They have cleaned house of some of the old guard, but obviously a lot of them are still present. They've won Great Place to Work, right? Which was something they had worked for. And yet a couple of the stakeholders just below the C-suite really had a feeling that something is wrong. And as you can tell, is absolutely off color. If you saw this in your organization, I can imagine it would be alarming. So we talked to basically 60 SVPs throughout the planet. They have locations. Oh, sorry, there's an air drill. But we talked to these leaders, and these are people just beneath the C-suite, and it was behind closed doors, and it wasn't recorded other than copious notes, and that these are the future of the organization, and this is how they feel. So you can imagine if we went down the managerial ranks, how much worse the people who report to them are feeling about the organization. Do you guys have any comments or questions? Kind of bad, right?
Yeah, I was wondering, what kind of questions did you ask?
We really started out talking about or inviting them into a conversation about the culture, like what is going right here. So we started out, what is going right here? Because if you start out a conversation with what's going wrong, people go down the rabbit hole really, really, really quickly. So we started out just kind of asking them, let's talk about the culture. Has it changed? Blah, blah, blah. And very quickly, even starting out on a positive note, in focus group after focus group, because we did it by geography, this is where the conversation went. And I can send you those actual questions. I mean, that's not a problem. So the reason that I wanted to share this was really to kind of set the stage that it's very difficult to have a conversation about engagement without talking about trust. And it's very, very, very difficult to have a conversation about trust if we're not going to look at authenticity and imposter syndrome. So I just want to share some findings that aren't from my firm, right? They're from Edelman, right, which is huge and has mammoth resources. They do a study every year called the Trust Barometer, and they go around the planet and they really assess what are the verticals of trust on the planet that people are feeling good about and what are they feeling not so good about. And about 2 years ago in the 2018 study, they found alarmingly for the first time, the average person is trusting their employer more than they trust government, more than they trust media, more than they trust church and religious leaders. And this was really a first for them to be seeing this. And part of what it raises is that in a world where trust is absent, is a vacuum, where are people turning? Who are people relying on to get their back, to give it to them straight, to take care of them? And more and more and more and more, they're looking to their employers. Now, the interesting thing is there was a difference between how they felt about business in general, which was still pretty low, but how they felt about their employer, someone who they have a social and an actual contract with. They have a higher expectation that that organization and the leaders within it are going to treat them fairly. So this just kind of bears that out. It's not a great picture until you look at my employer. The ways in which they are looking to our organizations to express leadership is not just in how do we get things done. How do we lead with respect to the industry? How do we respond to political things going on? What about national crises? And then what about the things that impact me specifically? Now, the study is really exhaustive. I can send you the link to it, or you can go on to Edelman and download it. But it really goes into the environment, social issues, #MeToo, et cetera, et cetera. And people are looking for our organizations to express a leadership point on all of these questions and issues. They also are looking to be included as part of the conversation and not just existing in a command and control type environment. Now, the reason I want to share this with you is this is the kind of fuel that you need to be taking to your decision makers, your C-suite, to say, look, we got to step up to the plate. The thought of just having a CEO up on high, someone that you're kind of afraid of and submissive to, is not just shifting because of the millennials coming in and having an expectation of having a more participatory experience. It's actually being influenced through social media, obviously, Glassdoor, et cetera, but really because the nexus of being a fully expressed human at work has already happened. This really pertains when we look at the C-suite. So this old guy, the dinosaur behind the desk, is what people don't want. They don't want someone to be pretending to have it all together, to stand behind super polished language, to stand behind pedigree or what has been vetted by the PR team. They're really wanting a CEO to step forth and be fully human and fully expressed. Now, this need for spontaneity is something that has never been seen before, right? The old school assumption that I'm going to trust my CEO because he or she seems perfect, seems like they have it all together, they've got an answer for everything. This is really dead. And the research is bearing that out. Now, you and I on this call, all of us, we probably know this, right? And what's interesting is I led a panel on this. This is research that is unveiled every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I was talking to the CHRO at Mercer about this information and about what she sees in her culture. And she says, yeah, it's great. Heads nod. They all say this is a great idea. They all agree. But when it comes down to having a microphone put in front of their face or having a story about them in Forbes, everyone suddenly gets very, very afraid, right? So one step is having this information ready and socialized with them. Another thing is really training them on how do they live from this place every day at work. So it's not being polished, it's modeling having human concerns and challenges, i.e. the work-life balance question. It's also saying that even with that in place, employees need again and again and again to be shown that you are willing to tell the truth. You are willing to be transparent. This slide here that shows when I'm getting information about where the organization is going, et cetera, it's kind of sad, but although there is an uptick in CEO across the board, employers are more quick to trust peers, to trust an outside expert, et cetera. Now that's pretty sad. If I'm curious about how my company is doing or going, and I can't trust what my CEO says or what my boss says. So we really want to drive this home that this is a huge opportunity for leadership within the organization to step forward and give it to me straight. Be personal. Tell me about your life. Tell me what you've struggled with. Tell me what it took for you to be who you are, because that is going to make me feel more safe to share what my challenges are, or to share who I actually am. And so this, knowing the obstacles, knowing their success story, etc. We have seen again and again, heads nod, they say, yeah, that's a great idea. But when you actually canvass the C-suites within organizations and ask people to share an obstacle they've overcome, to share a success story, oftentimes because of imposter syndrome, even though this person is the CMO, the CHRO, you name it, a lot of times we're still hiding behind a veneer of perfectionism. So this is a huge thing for all of us on this call to really think about. How do we move beyond that? How do we get them ready? Not to just say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, but then have them step forward in front of a microphone or in front of a camera or someone who's writing a story about them and really share from that standpoint. So when we talk about this perfectionism, right, I think that there's this obsession with relativity, right? Am I doing better than my peers? Am I doing better than so-and-so? And when we think about what drives people to want to participate in corporate cultures, a lot of times it really is that box checking, right? Do I have the right degree? Did I go to the right clubs? Did I play the right sports? Was I on the debate team, right? And that just kind of parlays. You can think about how from our childhood, that kind of preparedness and focus on preparedness to meet muster is a great thing, right? It inspires us, it drives us to acquire new skills. But the question is, at what point does winning actually become our Achilles heel as a leader? And that's what we see over and over and over again. We've worked with a ton of companies on these questions. I'm just going to pause. Does anyone have a comment or question? No. Okay, good. So when we look at those studies, and we sat and went through basically the volume of work that we've done, right? And when I correlate what the cultural issues are that companies are coming to us expressing, and we get beyond Great Place to Work, or we get beyond a Tiny Pulse type survey, and we really start talking to the influencers within the organization, it is conformity that is fostering this negative ecosystem, right? And so what's interesting about how corporate America, or corporate culture, because it's global, is handling this is they're saying, great, let's get someone with a great a title like Chief People Officer, Chief Engagement Officer. Let's give them a bunch of money. They're going to be way qualified for this. They're going to have a track record of making shifts happen. And we're going to give him or her a title. Oftentimes it's a her, let's face it. And we're going to give her a budget, and she's going to make all these problems go away. And we're not going to have to worry about it, right? And that oftentimes is the giant leap the organization has made, that we're going to make a proclamation that this matters to us, and we're going to put some money behind it and a body and maybe a team supporting that body to approach it, to deal with it. And what's really happening is we're outsourcing something really messy that cannot be solved other than by engaging the entire ecosystem. So a lot of the folks that I talk to, they've got the title, they've got the budget, but what they're really struggling with is that question that was asked: how do you convince management to have this be more than something that is just outsourced or insourced to one specific person, right? So really going beyond Great Place to Work, going beyond any of the surveys that you may be doing internally, leveraging the data points, obviously, to hold it in front of management and say, this is an issue, absolutely. But then saying to them, the impact of this is not you giving me more budget. The impact of this is how do we engage the entire C-suite and looking at what their role is in co-creating this culture every single day. What I think is fascinating is that increasingly corporations, their boards are starting to look at these things and starting to put pressure on the CEO and part and parcel the C-suite he's created to hold their feet to the fire. So I think that for some of you who have roles in companies with large boards, you can oftentimes look at where the board is coming from and use that as fodder in your conversation to say, I think this would be an issue the board cares about. So let's really sit down and create a strategy to make sure that it's more than heads nodding, to make sure that we are engaging these stakeholders that make the cultural reality of what it is to go to work every day. So I wanted to also talk about the reason I think that imposter syndrome is so key to this is this term originally came up to really mean people who are outside the historically represented groups. And in working with folks across the spectrum of social, of demographic, of racial, of ethnic, what we've seen is that imposter syndrome is ubiquitous. Imposter syndrome impacts the most Brooks Brothers, salt and pepper hair person that seems like everything has been handed to them. Like, it impacts everyone who's making a decision every day. In fact, studies have shown that if you want to shift the course of a conversation or the outcomes of a committee or how a meeting goes, in general, you need to have at least 3 people who are underrepresented for the people who are historically represented to actually begin to feel safe to voice their own ideas that may be contrary to what the group would normally make the call as being. Does that make sense? So by having diverse voices involved en masse within a committee, within a team, within an ad hoc or a pre-existing team, you actually bring out the secret creativity that's lurking underneath the layers and layers and layers of grooming and pedigree that all of us hide behind. All of that will start to come forth from everyone present. And I think that's a really powerful thing for us to remember when we're looking at troubleshooting what's going on within the ecosystem, is how does that play out in your teams? How does that play out in your recruitment strategies and your retention strategies? Like, is that really a part of every single conversation about the human experience and about getting things done within the organization? Realization 2, no one is stronger than their nervous system. So that person who may have given you the title and the budget and says, great, make all these problems go away, the minute it gets messy, if it starts to confront their insecurities, they're going to shut down. And we have seen this over and over again, where a company will have a leader who makes giant proclamations about, let's reinvent who we are. We're going to be human. We're not going to do things the old way. We're going to be collaborative and creative, and we want everyone to bring their whole self to work. Have you guys heard that phrase over and over and over again? I'm assuming, right? What happens is that sounds great until it gets really sticky, until the inevitable messiness of human beings starts to be something they have to get involved in retroactively, right? So the question for us becomes, how do we do this from step one? How do we do it from the moment this proclamation is made? Great. You say you want to take on culture. You say you want to solve for X, Y, or Z that's going on. I can't do it without you, even with my title, even with my budget. It's going to take your personal involvement and that of all the influencers within the organization. Can I expect that from you? Do you have my back on this? And that type of conversation has to be had eyeball to eyeball. And then it's got to be obviously documented. So when you see this happening, when you see that it's been an urge towards, oh, let's just let them solve that, that's a moment that you turn right back around and say, great, it's a we question. It's not a me question, it's a we question. The reason this happens is that everyone you're talking to is burnout, even if they have work-life balance practices, etc. This is an old study, but I'm willing to bet it's even worse now. And when you are dealing with people who are burnt out, the last thing that you want to bring them is a surprise. You want to get in front of it when these conversations are first being held about what they should expect their involvement to be, and what they should expect in terms of your need for them to be visibly engaged and not just tangentially on a blog post, right? So these are really important things to bear in mind. The last thing is that you will not always be able to get rid of people. As you saw from the testimonials from the study I shared at the beginning, you will not be able to get rid of everyone who is a problem. Unfortunately, it'd be great if we could just say that person's toxic, et cetera, and say, bye-bye, you don't belong here anymore. Leadership will not make those moves so drastically in 99% of the cases. So the question becomes, how do you work with that person? And I've seen a lot of organizations try and work around them, right? I've seen a lot of the firekeepers try to create strategies and programs and initiatives that kind of circumvent that person's influence. And I'm going to recommend to you to actually do the opposite and to engage them up front and face to face. Understanding you're not going to convince them to be other than who they are, but by engaging in dialogue and giving them a sense of influence in whatever the strategies are that you come back and recommend, they will know that their voice has been heard. And you may actually learn things or come up with ideas. This goes back to the diversity present in every question, right? It's funny, I was speaking to Marie Claire, who is the CHRO at Edelman, and I asked her that because they're an old school firm. They've been around forever. They're family owned. And I said, what do you do about the dinosaurs? And she says, I include them in the conversation because if I don't, everything will fail. So the reason this gets kind of tricky is that research shows that psychopathy, right, which is an 8-point kind of profile of things that psychopaths do to manipulate and stay in control, has a 3x incidence over the general population in corporate cultures, right? So you've got to really realize that this battle is not just something that you are waging on your own, and it's not just that one person, that there is something inherent to the power structures that are corporate organizations that is going to attract people who are toxic to the organization. That is natural. And they are oftentimes very charming. They are oftentimes incredibly socially skilled. And they are fight to the death in terms of maintaining their power structure. So this, to me, is an even stronger argument for how do you engage with the people who are opposing that change, because they will not let go. And so until they are part of that conversation and they feel some influence, their urge to fight what's going on is going to be that much stronger. So I think that it's tough, right? I think that we can look at the people who take a stand. We can look at people who agitate for change in culture at their own cost, and we can see their humanity. It's really easy for us to be touched and to feel compassion and even to feel inspired, right? And I think that if we care about corporate culture, we actually have to look at all the people that we see as shells of human beings that we have in some ways cast aside their humanity. And we have to back up and we have to acknowledge that we are treating them exactly the way they are inclined to treat the world. And by doing so, nothing can move forward. So until we can sit across from the desk from those very people and understand their fears and understand their concerns and really have them matter, we're actually guilty of being exactly the type of cultural contributor that we're trying to solve for. So humanity, right? Because it really does boil down to how is both the organization solving for Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but also how are we solving for our own? Because there's both intrinsic infrastructure that either supports or sabotages our ability to thrive in the collective, and there's the extrinsic piece. And so one thing I like to say to firekeepers, is that if you're not solving for this for yourself, it's going to be really hard for you to have a cogent argument for solving this for the collective, right? And having this actually be somewhat of a guide, a true north, right? For you to think about, are we taking this on, and is everybody engaged in finding this way and finding these touch points and these scaffoldings that are going to allow the organization to rise. There's somewhat of a continuum. I really want to get to the hacks though, because I see we're already at 11:33. So when we work with companies, and this is something that you can do for yourself, really be aware, have you humanized how you're seeing the people who may be the biggest obstacle? And that is the hardest thing to do, because when you're fighting against someone, seeing their humanity can be the most challenging thing, but it's also, anyone in conflict work will tell you, that's how you start to find common ground. Strategic engagement. When you get the go-ahead to move forward on anything, don't just take it and run. Turn back with that go-ahead and say to your stakeholder, say to the influencer, how involved are you willing to be? Because if you're not, let's not waste time and not pretend. Third, understanding the ecosystem. Again, a lot of times we're approaching this as being something that can be solved through policy or through programs. And that is a recipe for failure. In fact, by creating policies that the ecosystem has not adjusted to align with, you're actually eroding trust, right? By creating programs that people don't feel safe to participate in, it may seem like an advance in the moment, but if people don't feel safe, you're actually eroding any trust that does exist. Relative position can be a really helpful thing for you to have in your back pocket. Being able to look at the business impact, you can go case by case, group by group, and start to look at, based on the survey outcomes you have, start to look at what are the metrics of highly performing teams. And this is something that Google started to do forever ago. A lot of companies have copied, but even in small organizations, 100 or 200 people, you can start to look at what the high performing teams are and start to say, A, is this real? B, what's going on underneath the surface? Let me look at the attrition. Let me look at the HR incidents, et cetera, and really start to make the business case. Toes in water is really important, because if you can, once you've gotten this go ahead and you've gotten the agreement from the C-suite that, yeah, I'm in, I'm going to help you, you need to create an ask immediately, a very specific one for a pilot that will have them start to experience what change is going to necessitate. So by doing that, you're actually adapting them and you're socializing them to support making these goals a reality. And then stakeholder buy-in we've talked about, and metrics. So this is kind of a checklist just to prompt your own thinking about whatever the problems or conundrums you're trying to solve for. And inside of each of them, there may be entire systems and strategies and approaches for you to start to work, because once you have all these pieces in place, then you've got a culture that's evolving of its own steam, and not just because there's a proclamation or you've got a great title, right? Or you've found some great vendors to help you create some changes, right? Once you have all these pieces in place, it actually becomes an automatic outcome of what the we is within the organization. So it's 11:37. I know we've got time for questions. I just wanted to open it up and see what you're thinking about.
We have a question that Tom wrote in the chat. I don't know if you saw that. So Tom wrote 2 questions. Okay, so I'll just read them out, Tom, unless you want to speak. Where's Tom?
I see Tom. Hi, Tom.
Oh, there's
I'm
Tom.
here.
Oh, Tom, do you want to read out your own questions?
Oh, sure, why not? You talked about engaging with dinosaurs in an organization. I see the effective asshole being a pretty common species as well. I'm curious, how do you engage them? Are they a type of dinosaur, or how do you handle them?
That's like leaning towards psychopath, actually. When you've got an effective asshole, as you said, if you don't engage them, then you're dead in the water. Because of their effectiveness, right? They're going to have street cred throughout the organization, right? And like that first slide I showed with all the feedback, the comment was, why are we supporting and praising these brilliant assholes, right? Was the quote from the study. You know, I'm willing to bet that no one that answered or that agreed to participate in the focus groups considered themselves a brilliant asshole. True? So that those are the people who automatically opt out of doing cultural work, means that having that buy-in from whoever is most senior to them from the onset is really important, because otherwise they will not come to a focus group. They will not come to a training. They will not encourage their people to, because they don't see that as being part of what has made them successful. They don't understand that what got them to where they are is problematic, right? So I think that's a really great question, and you gotta address it head on. You need to address it with whoever is the senior most people in the organization, because otherwise change will not happen and they will sabotage you.
Yeah, that was my question. How do you deal when they start sabotaging?
How do you deal when they start sabotaging? Well, it's going to happen, right? And so that leads to a lot of CYA, right? But it also leads to having the entire stakeholder collective engaged in accountability for making shifts happen. So let's say that you've gotten the buy-in from the CEO, right? Or from the CHRO, who hopefully has gotten the buy-in from the CEO, that you've somehow come up with mutually agreed upon human metrics, right, that you're going to hit. When a brilliant asshole starts to sabotage that just because it's uncomfortable, he or she is not on board, you need to be able to look at how that is preventing you from hitting the metrics the organization has agreed upon, and turn to whoever is senior most and say, look, this is what's happening. Because this entire bargain is predicated upon transparency. And if you can't be transparent, that's where you get in trouble. The organization who commissioned us to do that study had complete blessing up and down the ranks of HR. The CEO was behind it. But when we shared those findings, because the brilliant assholes were not engaged, they went ballistic. And it's a great example of what I want to encourage you not to do. Don't do it from the side. You got to do it from the center. Does that help? I hope. It's not easy. It's scary. But why bother if it's not going to work, right?
I guess you have to hope that the CEO isn't one of those brilliant assholes. Is that right?
Well, well, here's a question, right? The heads nodding thing, right? When the CHRO, her name's Liz Cole, she's so great, said to me, yeah, my entire senior team, their heads nod when we talk about all this stuff. But if no one present in that conversation says, great, this is what it's going to mean, I am going to hold you accountable for this, then they've kind of set you up for failure. Do you get what I mean? So you being able to recognize when you've been set up for failure is really important. And you being able to have that conversation with whoever is looking at you for your KPIs, right? Because you've got a job and that's how you keep your job, right? But you being able to say, I'm kind of being set up for failure because we actually don't have the buy-in that we need to accomplish what you're asking me to do. A lot of truth talk. And it's a lot of correlating the reality of what's happening in leadership, what change is actually going to require.
Got it. I had a second question.
Absolutely.
It kind of flows into it, is in your hacks you mentioned, okay, you mentioned metrics. What are examples of metrics that you would set up as, I guess, benchmarks to hold a management committee accountable? Is it employee retention? Is it Gallup scores? You know, what?
So for every company, it's going to include kind of the usual suspect stuff, right? Retention, recruitment, like how often do we get the people that we really want? But it's also HR incidents. It's how much is this costing us? When we sit down with a company, we ask them what is the most important thing they are trying to solve, right? Because I would really suggest if you're trying to cure the whole culture, you're going to die a very exhausted death, very sad, very lonely. If you can pick one thing that you want to solve for straight out of the gate and really focus on that, then you can build the metrics around it. And a lot of the human metrics, it's funny, I sat down with Robert Soros when he brought us in, and I had the metrics conversation with him. What are you looking for? What should we be capturing? He looked at me and he said, I know you have to ask that because it's the business thing to do. But he said, all of this is so longitudinal and there's so many factors involved. It's kind of a fool's errand to even make you capture all that. Now, not every CEO is that enlightened, right? Like obviously. But so the more that you can hold it to the culture keepers, right? The C-suite, what are we really trying to solve? Then you can build the metrics around that. And a lot of what you're already capturing within the organization just has to be brought in to make that case. And it will be triangulated, it will be correlated, etc. So anyone who's really nebbish can give you a hard time about that. But you have to do it anyway, because there will be people around the table who are able to connect the dots and will support you in your connecting the dots that way.
Would a metric like employee engagement or the Gallup scores, those seem so broad to me that it seems difficult to pick that as one.
Well, you know that it's problematic, right? Because until you sort, whether it's Gallup or it's Great Place to Work, until you sort that by every demographic, male, female, it's really easy to get a false impression that everything is great, right? One CEO I'm friends with, well, actually, she was a consultant. She's now gone on to be a CEO, but she was working with an organization and they had great culture scores. Oh my God, they were through the roof. But it's because they only hired people who think exactly like those values. And so while they were hemorrhaging all the creative minds, they were losing market share, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're like, oh, but our culture's great. And it wasn't until she stepped in and said, wait a minute, we got to slice and dice this with more specificity, because until we get at that, we're just going to continue to be this command and control culture that only attracts command and control people who want to be commanded and controlled, right? So I think that those are helpful metrics, but that comes back to don't drink your own Kool-Aid, right? The question that prompted the study I showed you that had all the horrible quotes was one outlier on their Great Place to Work. They had huge pride. The question about, are you proud to work here? It was like 90%, right? But the question that showed them that they have a serious problem was, would you recommend working here to friends or family? And it was like 30%, right? So you really have to not just say, oh, here's our score. You really got to, draw out, where are my red flags? Like, what's not jiving? And then you can start to have conversations about what the problems might be that drive those red flags to go flying up.
Okay, some people wrote in some questions, Tevis, before. So I'm just gonna ask a couple of those, and then if anyone else has some ending questions, we can get those as well. So, sorry, I'm just looking. There's like a bunch of them. So Natalie says, how would you relate the corporate culture to the change we as humanity must undergo in order to sustain our environmental basis of living? And what practical steps may arise out of this, if any? I'm gonna paste this.
I love Natalie. Natalie, we need tea or something. Everything is a mirror of everything else, right? And what Natalie is asking, she's obviously answering her own question, right? That this evolution of corporate culture is absolutely in lockstep with the challenges facing us as a human race and or species, right? And in terms of making those shifts, like how do you get started? I'd find the biggest pain point. Just look for the biggest pain point of the organization and figure out what is the smallest way you can shift the needle on that. Because if you get some incremental successes going on something that everyone acknowledges is a problem, again, don't tackle culture. What the hell is culture? That's huge. We're a culture. Just being on this call, we've created a culture, right? So find the foothold that's going to let you begin to scale that mountain. Because otherwise you're just looking at the mountain and you're going to be like, oh my God, it's never going to happen. Sam, I can't tell if you're talking.
No, I'm not talking. I froze for a second.
Okay.
So Natalie, I realize you're on Nadine, you're on the call, and I asked your question, but thank you.
Oh,
There's admitting that.
Hi, Natalie.
Does anyone else have any more questions for Tevis before we sign off? You're right. We could like talk about this. You're right, for ages. Tevis, you should just come back every month and do something.
Well, what I think is cool though is that in each of these there are ways to make moves. Like in each of the points I gave you, like if you just actually task yourself with focusing on one point at a time, it's a lot less overwhelming, right? So start with, how do you see people? Because that's really hard for us to get into our own heads and start to see where our filters may be the problem. So like, just task it out with little tiny things for yourself. And then you're going to have the fodder to be able to ask for the levels of changes that you're asking the organization for.
Very, very uplifting, motivational note to end this on. Really, thank you so much. And guys, thank you everyone for joining. For everyone who's watching this on YouTube, be sure to join us every month. We have a seminar. August, we're taking the month off, but we will be back in September. So be sure to sign up now for September. And if you have any requests about who you'd like to see speak, then let us know. And Tevis, thank you. You're fabulous.
Thank you guys so much. And feel free to reach out if you want to.
Yes. Tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Okay. So I'm at Tevis at balanceintegration.com. And you can, I don't tweet a whole lot, but I'm Corporate Yogi on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. You can follow us on Facebook. My company is Balance Integration, and it's balanceintegration.com. And there's a couple things I do just to support people. I do periodic, really executive level meditations and clarity practices, and they're free. We don't charge anything for it. It's just something I love to help senior leaders do. So you guys take care of yourselves. Like, that's the other thing I see a lot, is there's a lot of I wish they would, right, that goes on with the firekeepers. And I'm like, well, you got to do that for yourself. So that's something. And yeah, just stay in touch.
Amazing. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining.